Hello, everybody. We are ready to start session number 2. If everybody can please be seated. And can I request the speakers to come up to the front desk? My name is Kavi Bhala. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of International Health and with the Johns Hopkins International Injury Research Unit. It gives me great pleasure to moderate the second session of the symposium. So without further ado, I'm going to invite Professor Flavio Pechansky to come up and tell us about drugs and alcohol. Thank you.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to thank the invitation to participate in this symposium and acknowledge the work of my colleagues, Tanara Souza, who is here with me, and Graciela Passa and Juliana Scherer, who are at the center in Porto Alegre, Brazil. It is also interesting for me, on a personal note, to be back to Hopkins as a professor and center director. I was a student here in 93, 94. I had a picture of my badge from that time. I decided not to show it. But again, thank you for inviting me. Some of the things that were covered before lead us to what I want to present, which is a little bit of the history of drug driving. And I'm not being country specific. I'm not focusing on Brazilian data only, although I'll speak a little bit about that in the end. But as was mentioned before, this is a major problem in the world. But as you can see, only 7% of the world's population have the adequate laws to address all of these large risk factors that were mentioned before. And what is the role of drunk and drug driving in this profile? As you can see, it seems to be big because this is the map of the different countries with their different drunk driving laws. Most of the countries have them. There are a few which have no laws, and there are some countries in which there is no alcohol consumption. So it is a worldwide problem. And again, my role here is to talk about what's the role of drug driving in the whole scenario of those 1.24 million accidents we have per year, that we have per year. So a little bit of history. The first car, or if you want to call it that way, was developed by Carl Benz in 1886. And it took 11 years for the first DWI offense to be recorded. This was a cab driver in London who slammed into a lamppost and was drunk. And this is reported in the newspaper. And the first DUI laws, they are about 100 years old. There's some doubt whether they were passed before in either Massachusetts or New York. But we're dealing with something that is at least 100 years old in terms of law. The field changed when Robert Borkenstein developed the breath test. This is the breathalyzer of that time. This contraption that he's holding, this huge machine, that's the breath test that they had at that time. But the Grand Rapids study was very important because it was able to show a relationship between crashes and blood alcohol content. And this is a picture of a modern breathalyzer. Of course, it looks like an iPhone or something similar to that. But just to show you that there's been a lot of evolution in terms of how do you develop these devices to collect different types of sample, either saliva or sweat or blood, to learn about the impact of drugs and alcohol in the system. And for example, this is one of the brand new ones. This is for saliva testing. It has a cartridge that allows you to collect saliva on the field and measure a panel of 5 or 6 drugs. It takes about 4 minutes. Our center is starting to work on this device next year. So basically, it has been easier to know about the use of either drugs or alcohol than it was many decades before. And Borkenstein's curve for alcohol is still valid. This is the original risk curve that he developed for BAC, blood alcohol content, and relative risk for accidents. You can see that it is exponential, but it starts to kind of explode at the 0.08 level. And this was done in 1964. Many other studies were conducted using the same methodology or the same approach. And again, you see the same kind of threshold. From 0.08 on, basically the risk explodes. And there's been a lot of data validating this idea that the more you drink, the more the risk increases. When we come to marijuana, THC, and other drugs, the history is much more recent. For example, one of the first papers that I found about marijuana and driving was published in Science in 1969. And basically, it was not separated from alcohol at that time. So they wanted to know whether using marijuana would increase or decrease the effects of alcohol on a driving simulator. And they found that impairment in simulated driving performance does not seem to be a function of increased marijuana dosage or inexperience with the drug. The picture is a little different now. I'll tell you about it a little later. And cocaine, the first studies about cocaine and driving have been published around the 80s as the Journal of Forensic Science. And as you can see, it was found in only one case of saliva collected in impaired drivers. So it was not either popular or they didn't have the appropriate technology to cover for that drug at that time. There's a question that's still ongoing. Although there has been a lot of progress in this field, how do you assess impact? How do you know that someone is impaired by using a drug and driving? It's not an easy answer. The gold standard would be really driving while intoxicated on a real road, on a real situation, and there's only a few countries that allow for this type of experiments, for example, Netherlands. And they're very risky, in fact. There are driving simulators. The most advanced driving simulator has just been announced in the US by NHTSA, I think this year. But of course, they're very expensive. And some of them can mimic life situations, some cannot. So again, thinking of low and middle income countries, what is the appropriate proxy? What's the device or what's the technology that we can use in our countries to approach and address this problem on our own environments? There are some, and I'm going to show one example, is the SDLP. Basically, that's the standard deviation of the lateral position, or if you want, how much you weave when you drive. And this has been shown to be very sensitive to drugs. There's been a review of more than 60 studies showing that this type of tracking test allows us to tell with some good accuracy whether someone is intoxicated or not by different drugs. Okay? So it can be used as a standard for DWI, and it's inexpensive because you can have it as a test that someone can do in a laptop. And you can bring the laptop to the field or bring the person to the lab without the whole structure of a driving simulator. And when we go drug by drug, alcohol is still the standard. You can construct different curves of dose-response effect on alcohol and driving skills. Basically, what you see here is, which is kind of intuitive for us, the more alcohol you drink, the more impact you will have on your driving, up to levels in which the alcohol will be high enough to really reflect on your driving skills. The problem is when it is low and you cannot have devices that cover for that specificity. But again, Borkenstein was right when he published his curve. When you adapt the curve of individual SDLP to the relative risk, you see the further the blood alcohol concentration, the higher the alcohol concentration, the further the deviation will be. So again, just to show that this is a good standard for drunk driving. For other drugs, we're still working on what is effective. It's not that simple. Marijuana, they have done some recent studies about it. And there's a group in Italy led by Battistella, which has made an interesting study that can be replicated in different settings. They ask for volunteers to smoke marijuana versus a placebo on a very controlled environment. They had to be right-handed because they were going through different tests, and if you are right or left-handed, that will interfere with the testing. But basically, they had a controlled environment, kind of a lab in which people would come up and smoke marijuana under very strict and controlled doses. And they went through a battery of tests, like visual analog scales, tracking tests is the one I mentioned before, and fMRI. And the results are, again, they're simple, they're intuitive, but this is a way to show the effect. That's what people are looking for right now. And marijuana is on the agenda as one of the drugs that really interferes with driving. So what you can see here is as soon the green line is the marijuana time profile in the subject's system. As soon as marijuana goes up, the red line, which is a visual analog scale response of the subject, goes up in terms of confusion and in terms of intoxication. No major change with the placebo. Okay? And so there is a perception of confusion, there is a perception of intoxication as soon as you have the marijuana cigarette. And when you're asked about your ability to drive, then you have what we're looking for. As soon as marijuana goes up in the system, the ability to drive goes down. There is no major change with the placebo. Okay? The interesting thing is that you can use this type of driving simulator on a laptop or visual analog scales, and at the same time you can do fMRI. And you can show, for example, in areas of the brain, the ones which are in red, when they light up during marijuana use. And these are specific areas of the brain that are related to the driving skills. So they have come up with a way to show that there is impairment in specific areas, and that can be assessed by different measures at the same time, which is exactly what has to be done. So there is already a point to say that there is no safe level for marijuana, even small amounts. For cocaine, there are different studies with the same type of finding. Cocaine is a stimulant, as you all know. It reduces reaction time, it improves vigilance, and performance in the highway driving test will actually improve, which is kind of scary. However, they are more alert, but they are also more euphoric. And for those of us who are clinicians and treat cocaine users, we know that there is a point in which this alertness changes into a lot of weird perceptions of how things are working around them. So this leads to overconfidence in driving skills, speeding, dangerous takeovers, and in the end, the conclusion that all these studies bring is that either cocaine has a negative effect from the beginning, or it may have a positive effect in the beginning, but it's counterbalanced by its stronger effect in the end. Ecstasy and methamphetamine have controversial findings because, again, they're stimulants, although their most potent effect is that they're also hallucinogens. And the only perception of the driver is that they're driving better when they are under the effect of MDMA, for example, which is ecstasy. It improves some things, but again, the problem goes to what they call the overconfidence of the driver, who feels that he's elated, feels euphoric, but then will take risks that he would not if he was sober, which leads us again to the consideration of unsafe driver. And specifically for methamphetamine, this is a kind of a roller coaster curve. You can see here that as soon as the amount of methamphetamine goes up in the blood, the curve, which is initially, I would say, positive, there's some improved in reaction time, the driver is less fatigued, then you start to have the negative effects, either the exhaustion at very low levels, but then when levels go up, you start to have paranoia, suspiciousness, delusions, hallucinations. I don't want to be in a car with a guy like this. So again, in the end, there is no safe level for drugs like amphetamines or methamphetamines, okay? Now, what is known in different countries? I'm not going to cover US studies, because I'm sure that most of our colleagues in the US are aware of the National Highway Transportation Safety Administration studies and the Pacific Institute studies that occur very, very often in the country. There are some data of the Druid study that I'd like to show because I want to compare them with some of the data we have in Brazil. So for the ones who haven't learned about the Druid, I would certainly suggest you go to their website. It was a very large study that ended in 2011, and it had 18 European countries involved and 36 institutes. It's got a lot of deliverables, a lot of manuals and PDF files that we can download. And basically, they collected different studies from lab to roads. And just to show you some of the prevalences that they found, these are overall prevalences. They're not disaggregated by country. Alcohol stands for 3.5%. Psychoactive medicines, which are growing from what we learn in the literature, in the specific literature, are about 1.36%, and mostly benzos. And illicit drugs are quite low. And again, as you can see here, mostly it's marijuana, cocaine, or combinations of drugs, okay? Okay, so this is basically the very summarized report of the Druid prevalences overall. But what about low and middle income countries? What about Brazil? What do we know about Brazil? I'm going to show data from a former study that our center has conducted because it was nationwide, and then I'm going to show just some feasibility of the data on feasibility of data collection that we have in our study with the group here at Johns Hopkins. This study was finished in 2008, and we have about 25 to 30 publications available on this study. Please feel free to ask me if you want. And this was a cross-sectional study. It was a roadside survey on all types of vehicles in the 27 state capitals of Brazil. And it was conducted together with the Highway Patrol, the Federal Police, and data collectors of our own team, which traveled to these places to collect the data. It was a very conservative approach and design because we were collecting data on Fridays and Saturdays, but we were finishing data collection by midnight. And we were not collecting data on holidays. We wanted to have more conservative data than, for example, going to a place where everybody drinks and drives, like close to a sports stadium on a Saturday evening. We wanted to see what the conservative side was. And we took breath tests, saliva tests, and a lot of questionnaires, again, using the NHTSA and the Pacific Institute standards. And the sample was about 3.4 thousand vehicles. And there's a lot of data on this. I'm just showing you one graph. What I want to show here is that we were able to see the differences between the types of vehicles and drivers. As you can see, for example, car and motorcycle drivers have one type of pattern of drug use, which is different from truck and bus drivers, of course. The amphetamines used here are very high for buses and truck drivers because they work long hauls and they want to be awake. They don't like to use benzos or alcohol as much as our motorcycle drivers do. They are the champions of every type of drug. Particularly, we have another study on delivery motorcycle pizza guys, the guys who deliver pizza for us. They were high in all types of drugs. And when we weighed and balanced our prevalences, the overall prevalences are here. For alcohol, it's 4.2%. Cocaine was high. Marijuana was low, and we challenged this data. The reason why is that we were collecting saliva for drugs other than alcohol. And the extraction of marijuana in saliva for analysis is extremely complicated. There's a lot of problems with the standards in the labs. So we believe this figure is lower than the typical. And our amphetamine used, then we learned later, we have a correction paper, that we were using kits that would not take 2 amphetamines, which are very common in Brazil. And then we reanalyzed them using the new kits, and this number really increased. I don't have it here, okay? Last, I just want to mention one thing. We've been collecting data in the 5 Brazilian sites, as Professor Haider was mentioning before, in this consortium with the many colleagues here from the US. And I just want to make one mention to one way of collecting data. And I'm going to give an example of 2 cities. We've collected data in 5 cities. This is the city of Palmas, which is in the middle of the country. And you can see here 3 types of information which are brought together, and that's what I wanted to mention. When we're looking at drug or alcohol use, unless you have a very high standard, such as collecting blood on a road, which is extremely difficult to make, you have to use different sources. So what we were doing here was to use different sources and see whether the trends go in the same direction. So I'm not going to comment on the interventions or the results of the interventions itself. I'm just going to show that when you take breath tests going down, and when you take reported drinking and driving in a questionnaire, this is with the police on site. But then you do knowledge, attitude, and practice, sorry, I was in Portuguese, sorry, survey, which was done by our staff with no police around. The numbers are a little higher, but again, they show the same trend in the same direction. This is only 2 data waves. We would need more. But again, everything goes in the same direction, okay? The other city, like Teresina, for example, which seems to have a different profile, does not show the same trend. For example, you see some reported drinking going down, the KAP survey going down, however, the breath tests are going up. What I'm just saying here is that this type of study that we conducted, and we're still analyzing a lot of the data that's coming in, shows us some feasibility. We're able to collect data in different ways and sources. And depending on the technology we can use, some are very cheap, like saliva testing and sending the saliva to the lab. That's not really, really expensive. But then if you want to have all these devices like the ones I showed, then the money goes up. But again, we've had an interesting approach with working with the police in different studies. It can be done. It needs a lot of work between institutions. Sometimes it's easier, sometimes it's more difficult. But what I'm showing is that there's feasibility here. I have my last slide, which is basically an invitation. In 2016, we'll have a meeting of the International Council on Alcohol, Drugs, and Traffic Safety in Brazil. And it's going to be in the city of Gramado, south of Brazil. In case you're interested in learning about this conference, which happens every 3 years, there's a website that you can check. There's a lot of information there, or talk to me during the day. Thank you very much.